All right, let's see if we can shed some light on Sonnet 55 by William Shakespeare, published in 1609. And I think this is a good sonnet to illustrate this notion that as long as you're willing to look up words in a dictionary and spend a bit of time puzzling things out, you can really do this by yourself. These sonnets are not that difficult, or at least not all of them are. It just takes a little bit of looking things up in a dictionary. So in this case, we start with a conflict or a contrast between two ways of remembering. And the one is to build monuments, right, like statues, and the other one is to write poems. And the word rhyme here in the second line means really poem. Now, the other word that needs some explanation perhaps is gilded, which simply means covered with gold. So we'll just say golden. As we read this now, it says, "Not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme," right? So you can build a statue for somebody, and there you go. Ooh, it's me. We should give him a bit more of a body, perhaps. Or you can write a poem. Which one is better? Which one do you prefer? Would you like to be remembered through a poem or through a statue? Now, when I talk about this with students, they typically say, well, a statue, of course, right? A statue is way better than a poem, especially a sonnet. But Shakespeare is trying to kind of play with language, and he's trying to give the surprising answer that the poem is better. That's what you should want. All right, well, let's see how this argument develops. He basically says, poems outlive monuments. Poems live longer. And you might say, well, that's weird. You can tear up a poem. Paper doesn't last as long, perhaps, as a monument. But let's see how the argument develops. He says, "But you, the beloved, you shall shine more bright in these contents than unswept stone besmeared with sluttish time." Now, this word sluttish here means dirty. So in Shakespeare's time, this was especially used to describe a woman who was sluttish in the sense not of being a whore as much as being unhygienic and dirty. So time ticks on, right? And the idea is that over time, this statue is going to get grimy. It's going to get dirty. So we'll just add a little bit of color here. We'll say that's dirt. Okay, the poem, meanwhile, is going to shine brightly. Okay, over time, the poem doesn't fade, and it's going to shine bright. Or at least the beloved shines brightly in the poem. Notice this clever little trick here that Shakespeare uses. He started by calling the monuments marble and gilded, but by this point, they are unswept stone, right? They're just stone, unadorned. Nobody takes care of them. And so through this kind of sleight of hand, by changing the language, it's already starting to sound much more negative to have a statue put up for you. All right, let's go on to the next quatrain here. And here Shakespeare writes, "When wasteful war shall statues overturn, and broils root out the work of masonry, nor Mars his sword, nor war's quick fire shall burn the living record of your memory." Notice, by the way, that each quatrain has its own kind of unity here, right? So 4 lines form a quatrain, and we have a rhyming couplet at the end. So that's kind of how the sonnet is organized here. Now, the word wasteful here does not mean that the war is not environmentally friendly. Wasteful here means destructive. Destructive. So war is destructive, and during wars, statues are often toppled and destroyed. And we have seen that, right? So that seems to be a decent argument. The word broils refers to disturbances, or riots, we'll call them here. So disturbances or tumults. And the idea here is that we have this metaphor of rooting something out. And if you think of masonry, right? So buildings are made of bricks, okay? And the idea is that if you have ivy, let's say, or any kind of plant growing over the masonry, then over time they'll grow right into the mortar in between the bricks, and that starts to root out the masonry. So the idea here is that over time, as we have these disturbances and conflicts, the bricks start to fall, right? Draw a little arrow here. And buildings and statues fall apart. By contrast, the poem and the person in it is still shining brightly. All right, next line is a little bit tricky here. It says, nor mars his sword, nor war's quick fire. And nor means really neither nor. So neither mars his sword, and you could say, instead of his, you could say like Mars's sword if you used an apostrophe. So Mars is the god of war, right? God of war. And this is basically just personifying war. It's saying the violence of war, right? That's one factor. Nor war's quick fire, and fire here destroys as well. So take your pick. You can destroy things through physical violence with swords or through fire. Neither of these things will burn the living record of your memory. And the living record, as you can probably guess now, is the poem, right? I mean, you could burn one poem, but if you publish a poem enough, you can't really get rid of that. You can't really get rid of the memory of the beloved. So at this point, you may be thinking, well, that's maybe not such a bad argument. I wouldn't mind being remembered through a poem. Maybe he's making a good case. And as I've said in other videos about the sonnets, a sonnet is really an extended pickup line, right? So it's an attempt to persuade you that you should go out with this person writing the sonnet. So it's all about cleverness and kind of showing off your wit. The next quatrain reads, against death, the A is missing there, but it really means against. Against death and all oblivious enmity shall you pace forth. Your praise shall still find room even in the eyes of all posterity that wear this world out to the ending doom. So the word enmity here means strife or conflict. And oblivious means forgetful. The idea here is that when there are conflicts in the world, it leads to a loss of memory. Libraries are burned, right? We lose records. And because of that, strife is a negative force in the world, especially in terms of the loss of precious things. But against this force of strife and enmity shall you pace forth. Your memory keeps kind of pacing forth almost as if into battle, and you are still being alive in a sense through the poem. So then it says, your praise shall still find room even in the eyes of all posterity. Posterity is future generations, right? The kind of offspring, we might say, of people. And so as people read this poem over the generations, your praise is still going to find room in people's eyes. And in fact, this can be taken quite literally, especially in the last lines as well. This idea that you are reading the poem and in your eyes you see the text, right? So the text is being reflected in your eyes, and so in a sense, yes, the poem is being remembered in this way. Now, the next line is not the most flattering. It says that wear this world out to the ending doom. So the ending doom, if you think of time, right? If we think of moments of time, this is at the very end. It's the final judgment when Christ comes back. This is a Christian context here, and ushers in eternal life. So at this point, that's kind of the ending doom, and in the meanwhile, people are wearing this world out. Notice that wearing here kind of harkens back to this notion of unswept stone besmeared with sluttish time. Right? The sense that over time, time corrupts. Time is not a positive force here. Then we get to the conclusion, and we have this poetic turn here with so. Shakespeare likes to do that. He sets up a problem and then he solves it at the end. And he says, so till the judgment, right, the final judgment here, that yourself arise, and that's when you arise physically from the dead in order to be judged by God. You live in this, and I think you can guess what this is. It's the poem. You live in this and dwell in lovers' eyes. So over time, you might be stuck in the grave in terms of your physical body, but you live in the poem. And as we said before, you are reflected in lovers' eyes. They read the poem to their beloved. You come alive again, and you are being remembered. So, is that a clever argument? Is that something that might persuade you? Well, I'd like to finish with a couple of thoughts in terms of whether this sonnet works or not. And the first one has to do with this question of who is the beloved, right? Somebody is being loved here and described, but who is this? Do we have any description of this person in the sonnet? Well, we don't. So then the next question is, who is famous? And this is a sonnet that deals with this notion of immortalizing someone. That's kind of the technical term here. Can we immortalize somebody through poetry? I think the person who's really being immortalized is not the beloved. It's Shakespeare. Shakespeare we still remember, but who is this person who's being described? We don't truly know. So it's kind of ironic then, isn't it? And Shakespeare seems a little bit more manipulative than we might think at first. He's using his beloved in order to make himself famous. Maybe we're not so happy about that. And then the last question to think about is, what is the worth of fame? Does fame even matter? Because if we think of this final doom here, what happens afterwards, right? Is the poem worth anything in the afterlife? Well, it only says till the judgment. So this is a poem that matters during the time period when people are alive, and that gives a kind of humanistic sense to the poem. It matters in this life, but in the larger scheme, maybe it has less significance. And so we have to question this notion of fame as well, especially from a Christian angle, which is what some of these terms really bring up here. Hopefully that lets you understand the poem. There's probably lots more to talk about, but at least it should give you a good sense of the basics of Sonnet 55.